Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And this week on the Quarter Deck, we'll continue our journey in our book with the 1st Marine Division in Iraq of 2003, No Greater Friend, No Worst Enemy. And this week we will be talking about the operational planning and update to what they were planning on doing, and specifically in the Highway 1 corridor. In our hero highlight this week, we will take a look at the story of Major Henry Talmag Elrod of the United States Marine Corps.
Drop and give me 25. I'm the gunny.
It's time for the gunning.
The Quarter Deck. Lights. Get online right now. You got 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Hello, my bunch of knuckle-dragging, beer-drinking, hard-charging devil dogs. You're listening to the Quarter Deck. I am your host, Miguel, the Gunny Signs.
Get off the bus!
I do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend
The Constitution of the United States.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
The Quarter Deck. It's Thursday, another day, another dollar, and it's time for everybody to get out there and clean their rooms. It is field day. But this week on the Quarter Deck, we're going to talk a little bit more about the time that I spent down there when we were getting ready to graduate from Marine combat training down there in Camp Johnson in North Carolina. And, we were down there, like I mentioned to you guys last week, throughout Christmas and also New Year's. Our class didn't graduate until the end of January. Now, once we graduated there, that's when we found out what our MOS was, and that's where I found out that I was going to be artillery. And to my surprise, my instructor told me that, I was going to be supporting the infantry, that was combat support, and me as a dumb young little PFC. Of course, if you remember, I asked him, does that mean I go to the field a lot? And all he did was look at me, okay, really? It's field artillery. What does that tell you? You're out in the field all the time, learning and supporting the infantry that's down there on the ground. Well, it was time to leave MCT, time to leave North Carolina. And now we were heading on a plane and we were going to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Yes, an Army base. That is where all the Marine Corps artillery is trained down there in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. But as you're going to see later on, this is not the only time that I went back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, because we're going to talk about a couple other times that I actually made the trip down there and spend time down there in Lawton, Oklahoma. Those of you that have been there, you know that there is hardly nothing that is there. So upon arriving there in Oklahoma, we have to check in at the airport with the liaison that was there to greet all the new coming Army soldiers and the Marines that were coming in to check into for their training. So we checked in there and they already had a shuttle locked on for us that we had to get tickets for to allow us to be able to transport it down there to the Marine barracks where we were going to be staying at. Now, during this time, when you checked into the barracks, it wasn't, your typical barracks like today. You weren't going to have your own individual rooms or anything like that. It was basically just an open squad bay. And we checked in and they assigned us a rack and stuff. And then we were there waiting for our class to actually pick up, to allow us to pick up to be able to train. Now, with artillery training school down there in Oklahoma, the artillery training school for a cannoneer, which is what I was in 0811, it was approximately a month long, so 30 days. But that didn't mean that you weren't going to be waiting around in the event that your class was not going to be picking up anytime soon. Luckily, when we arrived down there in the beginning of February, a class was picking up right away. So we were only on standby for maybe about a week or so, just getting checked in, getting our stuff put together before we actually picked up and we were ready to go. Now, artillery training school was something that was new to everybody because we had just graduated from Marine combat training where we basically learned all the ins and outs of becoming a basic rifleman, because the Marine Corps' mentality is that every Marine is a rifleman, regardless of what your MOS was going to be. Even if you were a band geek, you were still going to be able to be a rifleman first, because you never know when you are going to have to augment another unit as a basic rifleman in the event that more troops were needed for whatever reason, and your MOS was really not needed back in garrison for anything to be able to handle that. So they would be able to pull any Marine from anywhere, and they knew that everybody was trained to be a rifleman and then go out there and do what they needed to do. So for us, when we got there, we learned everything. They taught us everything about artillery. Now, when I was there, we learned about the O5, the O5 howitzer, as well as the M198 155 millimeter howitzer, which was going to be my baby for the next couple of years, because I was able to learn everything inside and out about this 16,000 plus beast that we were going to be learning about, and learning how to shoot, how to aim, how to ensure that we were pointed in the right direction, and basically getting the gun laid. Yes, I said getting the gun laid. That is the term that we refer to once the gun is actually in position. We were laid on whatever azimuth of fire we needed to be on to ensure that all of our targets were going to be within our left and right lateral limits to make sure that we were able to engage the enemy. Now, just because we had a left and right lateral limit didn't mean that we couldn't shoot other targets, because you were able to speed shift. And what that means is that you're able to get the crew of the Marines that you had to ensure that you're able to lift the trails up and rotate the gun on a small little plate that is known as the shift plate. And you were able to rotate that gun so you can shoot targets that were out of your azimuth of fire to make sure that you were able to engage these targets. So it was interesting to learn all these things, because, all of us were basically trained Marines coming in from actual MCT. Now, we were coming in to this training from the East Coast and from the West Coast MCT training facilities. So we were Marines from all over coming in to actually learn what an artilleryman does. So all of us learned every single job on that gun, from the number 1 man, number 2 man, 3, 4, number 5 man, the gunner, the A gunner, and so forth. So we had to learn every single position, and that was very good to know, because when you got out to the fleet, you would have to be able to actually learn how to do all these positions. Now, by no means, when you graduate from these MOS schools, are you an expert in that field. You learn everything else that you need to learn out in the fleet. From all the seasoned Marines that are out there, they're the ones that are going to teach you the ins and outs of actually shooting that gun as fast as you possibly can, loading it, reloading it, all those things, because there's different pieces to the howitzer. Not everything comes together. You have a primer that actually ignites, and when it ignites the powder, the bag of powder that you're going to shoot. That bag of powder then explodes, and it causes the projectile to be shot out of the howitzer and head downrange. Now, on top of the projectile, there is a fuse. That fuse can have different things that need to be on it. There's time fuses, there's point detonation fuses, all those different things. You have to learn exactly how to set the time on them that you receive from the Fire Direction Control Center. They're the ones that get the targets from the FOs, or the fire observers that are out there on the ground with the infantry, and they send us a grid to the Fire Control Center. They then take that grid and they determine exactly where the fire observers are, and then get an actual deflection and azimuth and everything that is needed for the gun crew to be able to load the gun with the correct amount of powder, or the powder bag that they're going to use, whether it's a green bag, a white bag, a red bag, or a supersized stick. Of course, in today's artillery world, those bag powders are rarely ever used anymore. Now they use max charges, which are, fiberglass encased charges that you can take them apart to allow you to have the correct amount of powder or charge that you need in order for that projectile to actually leave the tube and head down there. So it's separately assembled projectiles for the artillery. So that's why you have to have so many different numbered cannoneers, because some of them were working on the ammo pit, and they were responsible for getting the right fuse on the round, the right type of round. And since all the rounds were located there in the ammo pit, they all had to be separated by type, lot, and weight. Yes, type, lot, and weight, you have to segregate them to make sure that you had the correct amount of rounds. Because depending on the square weight, that's what we call the weight of the round, it's going to determine how accurate and how far those rounds are going to travel with the amount of powder that you're going to use. And that's very important, because if you didn't have the correct amount of powder or anything like that on the round, it's not going to go where you intended to go. and then you're going to have, a incident that you have, and then you're going to hear the dreaded words, to the rear of peace, fall in. That means something went wrong. Those are the dreaded words that you never want to hear, especially on a gun crew, because something has happened. The round landed in the incorrect area, and now they got to do an investigation to find out, what the heck went on. Was it the wrong powder? Was it the wrong fuse? Did it detonate too early? Or is there simply just something wrong with that lot of powder that we're using? Because some of that powder that we had back when I first came in 1995, it was freaking powder that they had from the freaking Vietnam era, old powder that we were still using and stuff. And, until this new stuff came about and it was tested and updated everything throughout the services, that is what we had. That's what we used. So it made it quite interesting. But down there in Lawton, Oklahoma, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do there at all whatsoever. And this was the first time that we were out there that we were actually being able to have weekend liberty, and we were allowed to go to places out in town. Now, by the time I got down there to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, I was already married. I had married my daughter, and during that time, they had left El Paso, and she had gone to live with an aunt of hers. I believe it was out there in New Mexico somewhere. They were living there, her and my daughter, and I was going down there to Fort Sill. Now, when we checked in, they specifically told us, those of you that are married, you are not allowed to have your wife here because you're going to be focusing on your school, and because we're freaking PFCs. We're young PFCs, dumb young PFCs. We had no money. We had money that we needed to have there to make sure we had everything we needed. So we didn't want any kind of distractions or anything like that to make sure that we were focused on that. But like a dumb young PFC, I had another dumb young PFC that we both got together and said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and get a room down there at the lodge here on base. And we flew our wives down here, and then they stayed there the whole entire time we were basically down in Oklahoma. And the only time I really got to spend with them was on the weekends. We were actually there the whole entire weekend. And also after we got secured from the schoolhouse, we were able to have a couple of hours of liberty. But of course, we had to go back to the barracks and sleep at the barracks. Now, luckily, then nobody ever found out that we had them there. However, once we left there, then we got to our first duty station, and we had to ensure that they were going to be where we needed them to be and stuff like that. But it was interesting because, like I said, there in Oklahoma, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing to do. I think the only thing that really the Marines all spent time with was going to the freaking titty bar. That's all they did. And back then, it was known as the Gold Dragon. This was the place that you wanted to go. Now, of course, on base, back then, as long as you were 18 years old, you were allowed to drink on base. And that was a big controversy way back in the day, and especially now, oh my God. God forbid a Marine is drinking and they're not 21. But back then, if you were 18, you were allowed to buy alcohol on base and drink there on base. So we used to always go down there to the NCO club, or was it the NCO club, or was it a separate club that they had for just young Marines and soldiers? I believe it was the NCO club, so we'll leave it as the NCO club. And we used to go down there and we were able to get some beer, play pool, and stuff like that. But down there in the Gold Dragon, you were actually able to go down there and they would sell you alcohol. Now, were they supposed to? No, because you're supposed to be 21 in order to have alcohol. Now, one thing you got to understand about Oklahoma back in the days, actually now, even now, God, I'm thinking about back in the days, even today, it's what it is right now. The alcohol content down there in beer and everything is very, very low. It's very low to what they're allowed to have in their beer. So it's basically what we called water beer is what we called it and everything. And looking at the internet and stuff, I realized that now Oklahoma has changed their law and now they have the regular amount of beer. Now, one of the big differences and the huge differences during that time was that out in town, they had that weaker beer or watered down beer that they sold in all the bars, all the sport bars, and at Gold Dragon that they had there. But if you were on base, you would actually have the beer that had the stronger alcohol content that they had in Texas and any other state that sold beer. So if you bought the beer on base, it was more alcohol, and you were able to get more beer for your buck if you look at it that way. But yes, they sold you beer by the gallon. Imagine that, young Marines going to this place and having beer by the gallon there on your table. Now, at the time, we thought it was a good idea because we can go out there and get beer, but eventually they ended up getting busted for selling beer to minors. But yeah, a gallon. Can you imagine having a gallon of beer there? It's almost like having a 40. Like back in the days in high school, I used to have a 40 and drink that, but man, it gets warm so fast that you're drinking that stuff, and by the time you get down there to a little bit below a half of what you're drinking, the beer is freaking lukewarm and it just freaking tastes disgusting. But I guess after you drink the first one, the second one just doesn't matter. It tastes just about the same. So that was basically everything that there was there really to do in Lawton. To go there, the mall is pretty much non-existent. It's a very, very tiny little shopping center and mall around there. And being a young PFC, of course, we really didn't go out in town and do searches for other things and everything like that that were out there to do. But most of the time I spent down there in Oklahoma was going to the schoolhouse, getting out, going down there to the lodge, spending time with the wife at the time and my daughter, and then heading back to the schoolhouse. That was basically my whole entire life that I spent down there when I was down there in Lawton. So, not too exciting when we're down there, but the month went by pretty fast. I was able to graduate as a basic cannoneer down there from Oklahoma and getting ready to head out there to the fleet. And that is when I received my orders to my very first duty station. Now, they had asked us where we thought that we wanted to go, our dream location that we wanted to go. Now, of course, for me, my very first pick was Camp Pendleton, California, because I had family down there in California. And I figured, hey, it'd be different to go down there. And of course, then it was Hawaii. And then it was ultimately the East Coast, which I didn't want to go to. Not that I would have cared back then because I was a young PFC and didn't really know the difference in the locations. All I knew is that there was artillery units in these different locations in the 1st Marine Division, the 2nd Marine Division down there in Hawaii, and there was one in Okinawa as well. But I picked Camp Pendleton, California, and they actually selected me to go to California. Well, I won't say they selected me. That's because that's where they needed Marines at the time. And I didn't know that in order to go to Hawaii, they preferred for you to be a single Marine, not be married or anything like that. So guess what? That disqualified me right then and there because I was already married and I had a kid. So I couldn't go there. So Camp Pendleton, California, here I go. And off we went down there to California, getting ready to get settled in and eventually bring my family down there to California. So we'll leave it there. So next week we'll pick it up a little bit more and talk about my experience on the flight from Lawton, Oklahoma, and eventually heading down there to California and being picked up by my very first unit and the check-in process that we went through because, oh my gosh, back in the day, it was very interesting to be a new joint heading into your new duty station. Are you looking for a photographer who can capture the most important moments in your life? Look no further than Miguel Saenz Photography. Miguel Saenz is an award-winning photographer with a passion for capturing the beauty and emotions of weddings, family portraits, and special events. With years of experience and a creative eye, Miguel Saenz will create stunning images that you'll treasure for years to come. Whether you're looking for a traditional wedding album, a unique family portrait, or a professional headshot for your business, Miguel Saenz Photography has the expertise to bring your vision to life. From the initial consultation to the final product, Miguel Saenz will work with you every step of the way to ensure that your images reflect your unique style and personality. Don't settle for mediocre photographs that simply document an event. Trust Miguel Saenz Photography to create timeless images that capture the essence of your special moments. Book your session today and experience the magic of Miguel Saenz Photography. Visit Miguel Saenz Photography online at miguelsaenzphotography.com to see examples of his work and schedule your appointment today.
What we're gonna do right here is go back. Way back into time.
Last week we continued our reading of our book with the 1st Marine Division in 2003, No Greater Friend, No Worst Enemy, and we talked about how the 1st Marine Division had worked up a target group of all pre-planned targets so they would have them in place for the fire support plan that was put into place so when the division crossed over into Iraq, they would have all these pre-planned targets. Now this week we're going to talk about the operational planning, an update to what the division had put into place. Specifically, they were talking about the Highway 1 corridor and how that was going to be beneficial to the 1st Marine Division. On 9 February, the division was to benefit from a fortuitous change in battlefield geometry. The unfinished Highway 1 corridor had previously been in the V Corps zone, just to the west of the 1st Marine Division zone. When complete, Highway 1 was going to be Iraq's Baghdad to Basra expressway. During the previous summer, the division had explored the possibility of using this battle space to enable the envelopment Al-Qut, but had been rebuffed by the CFLCC. The Army plan had changed, and the Army V Corps planned to shift much of its combat power to the Western Attack Corridor in their zone, leaving this major avenue of approach unused on their eastern flank. Out of concern for the main effort's open flank, CFLCC offered the Highway 1 corridor and the surrounding battle spaces to the MEF. The MEF planners solicited the opinion of the division, as it was not known if the incomplete highway was suitable as a maneuver corridor. The division planners were dumbstruck at their good fortune, where the division's scheme of maneuver had been previously dependent on a tremendous combination of goat paths, canal roads, and cross-country marches. The division was being offered a well-developed highway bed, large sections of which were paved, using J-stars, moving target indicators, recent U-2 imagery, HUMINT reporting, and map studies. The G2 Sergeant David Alwyn, Sergeant Christopher Cloutier, and Lance Corporal Marcellus Moore did an exhaustive study to independently verify the viability of the Highway 1 corridor. They found it to be well suited for a maneuver force. Iraqi civilian traffic was known to use the route, and it seemed to offer solid trafficability for military vehicles. Better still, the route could be improved to carry large-scale logistics traffic with some effort. With the recommendation of the G2, the division requested and received the Highway 1 corridor battle space. Based on the intelligence and new battle space, the division reconvened the opt and briefed the CG on 11 February. There was an immediate recognition among the division's tactical planners that this avenue of approach could significantly improve the division's speed to Baghdad. Opening the Highway 1 corridor would also allow the division to disperse in its maneuver to the Tigris over simple avenues of approach, presenting less of a target from WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, and reducing reliance on a single route, Highway 7. The CG made it clear that his ideal was for each RCT commander to have his own attack route. In addition to offering additional maneuver flexibility, a portion of Highway 1 north of Ad Dinawaniya had even been turned into an airstrip by the Iraqis, complete with control tower and a collapsible railing in the median. This airstrip, the Sheikh Hanusa Highway Airstrip, usually shortened Hantush or Hantush Airstrip, was in perfect position to serve as a KC-130 service pad, FARP. If the airstrip could be seized and defended, it would provide a critical refueling point for forces before they crossed the Tigris. The result would be the division getting across the Tigris with tanks nearly full, ready to push into Baghdad. There was another advantage to Highway 1, made clear when the division intelligence planner mapped out the detailed laydown of the outer defenses of Baghdad. The analysis revealed an interesting gap in the enemy's assessed indirect fire support plans. The Iraqis had pulled an Al-Nidia division tied up against the Dalia River, blocking the routes to Baghdad from the east. At the time, the Baghdad RG orientated the east and the north. In between, there was a 50-kilometer gap between the Iraqis that had not yet attempted to close this gap. The seam between these defensive belts would make the Baghdad RG division even more vulnerable to Blue Diamond's planned enveloping attack. And now, Highway 1 corridor offered an ideal way to exploit it. Highway 27, which branched off Highway 1 near the Hantush airfield, offered a narrow paved route that ran all the way to the Tigris River Bridge in An Namunia. Now, everything they're talking about, I can clearly picture in my head. because I can remember going down Highway 1. And in our mentality, we were like, oh my God, why are we all going in a single file line down this highway through this corridor? And we were lucky, I guess you can call it luck, that the Iraqis had no air superiority, because they would have had a clear shot of taking out the whole entire division, from tanks, artillery, to troop carriers. Because on Highway 1, it was just a straight shot, and we were traveling down this highway, simply one vehicle after another, because it was the fastest route and the quickest way that we were going to make it all the way into Baghdad. Now, they talked about the airstrip, the airfield that was going to be seized. This was a refueling point that ended up being used, because when we made it all the way through and got to this airstrip, we were able to refuel and had a clear shot without stopping again all the way into Baghdad, that allowed the division to go ahead and get in there and gain control of Baghdad as quickly as possible. And this, I got to tell you, going through this area on Highway 1, in order for us to actually occupy a firing position, we had to place in a pretty good size area, usually about a click. And in the country of Iraq, there's a lot of houses and there's stuff in the way along the route. So we found ourselves actually emplacing in the backyards of people's homes. To me, that would have been like, what the heck? Here I got a U.S. Forces artillery piece emplacing in my backyard. But this was something that, was compensating to them by us giving them rations of food that they had. Humanitarian rations is what we called them. And by far, these were just simply MREs with a way better menu than what we had in ours. And we were giving it to them for us being there and, ultimately, messing up their backyard with digging and shooting and all that stuff and everything that we had there in place. They took the food, they were very appreciative, and they were happy that we were there in the country. So next week, we're going to go ahead and talk about the operational planning, another update to that, and what they called running the seam. So we'll get into more detail with that, and just keep it in your mind as a division is progressing through Highway 1. Put yourself in the shoes of all the Marines of the division, and what could have they been thinking as they were moving down a paved highway and basically stopping there. And I got to tell you guys, it was a traffic jam of vehicles going through there. So it was interesting. So let's take a minute and just think about what they were going through, and we'll continue with our story next week. Hero Highlight. This week in our Hero Highlights, we take a look at Major Henry Talmag Elrod, United States Marine Corps. And we take a look at his story. Look at his story and what he did to earn himself that Congressional Medal of Honor. Henry Talmag Elrod was born on 27 September 1905 in Turner County, Georgia. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in December of 1927 and was appointed a Marine Second Lieutenant in February of 1931. He attended the University of Georgia and Yale University prior to his entry into the Marine Corps. Following over a year at the Marine Corps Basic School in Philadelphia and at the Marine Barracks there as a student aviator, Second Lieutenant Elrod was ordered to the Naval Station in Pensacola, Florida. There, he served as a company officer at the Naval Station and as a student aviator. He was promoted to First Lieutenant on 29 May 1934. In February of 1935, he earned his wings, and as a Marine aviator was transferred to Quantico, Virginia, where he served with a Marine aircraft unit until January of 1938. In addition to his other duties, he was squadron school, personnel, and welfare officer. He was also promoted to captain during this time on 1 September of 1937. In July of 1938, Captain Elrod went to San Diego for duty at the Naval Air Station and served as Squadron Material, Parachute, and Personnel Officer until January of 1941, when he was detached to the Hawaiian Island area. He arrived at Wake Island a short time before the hostilities commenced and was one of the 12 pilots who flew the Marine planes into the island. During the defense of Wake, Captain Elrod repeatedly displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty. On 12th of December, he single-handedly attacked a flight of 22 enemy planes and shot down 2. On several flights, he executed low-altitude bombing and strafing runs on enemy ships, and became the first man to sink a major warship with small caliber bombs delivered from a fighter-type aircraft. When his plane was destroyed by hostile fire, he organized a unit of ground troops into a beach defense and repulsed repeated Japanese attacks until he fell mortally wounded. Captain Elrod was killed in action, defending the Wake Island against the invading Japanese on 23 December 1941. On 8 November 1946, his widow was presented with the Medal of Honor, posthumously awarded to her husband for his heroic actions during the last bitter days of the defense of Wake. Major Elrod, who had been posthumously promoted to major in 1942, was initially buried on Wake Island, but he was re-entered into Arlington National Cemetery, Arlington, Virginia in October 1947. The Quarterdeck. This week in our Quarterdeck, in our reading of our book with the 1st Marine Division in Iraq of 2003, No Greater Friend, No Worse Enemy, we talked about how the 1st Marine Division had received a gift that they were going to take full advantage of. And that gift was that they were going to be able to use Highway 1 to allow them to move from Kuwait all the way up to Baghdad as fast as they possibly could. Next week in our reading, we're going to take a look at how they're updating their plan a bit more to ensure the division is going to have that success as they're getting ready to head into Iraq. In our hero highlights, we talked about Captain Henry Talmag Elrod and the things that he did as an aviator for the United States Marine Corps during the World War II era. Next week in our hero highlights, we will take a look at Private First Class Harold Glenn Epperson and take a look and see his story of the Congressional Medal of Honor and what he did to earn that award. With that being said, thank you all for joining me on this week's episode. Thank you to all my new listeners. And remember, you can now listen to the Quarterdeck on all of your podcasting applications that are out there. You can now just do a simple Google search for our podcast, and it'll give you a list of all the different media sources that it's available on. The big ones are the Apple, the Spotify, Pandora. They now carry our podcast, as well as do not forget about our Facebook page, The Quarterdeck with Gunny Signs. Feel free to leave a comment, ask questions so we can go ahead and ensure that we answer them here on our weekly podcast. Until then, enjoy your week, have a good time with your family, and we'll see you next week. This is Miguel, the Gunny Signs, sounding Liberty Call.
Get out the bus! I do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend
The Constitution of the United States.